According to Spencer Wells, the greatest history book ever written is the one hidden in our DNA. Florida prosecutors read the hidden history book that is DNA when they decided to use it as evidence of Tommie Lee Andrews' crimes. In 1987, prosecutors in Orlando, Florida, used DNA evidence to convict Tommie Lee Andrews of rape, breaking a boundary in the criminal justice system. It opened a new frontier for law enforcement, leading to the creation of national DNA databases to aid in the identification of criminals. And since then, DNA has played a key role in thousands of trials. DNA, aka deoxyribonucleic acid, is found in all cells, and it carries the genetic information for all living things. Since DNA is unique to an individual, with the exception of identical twins, it can play a major role in investigations. The United States Department of Justice said that DNA can be used to identify criminals with incredible accuracy when biological evidence exists. They also said that DNA can clear suspects and exonerate people who were mistakenly accused or convicted. In a case when a suspect is identified, they can use a sample of DNA to compare it to the DNA samples found at the crime scene. Another way that DNA can be used in an investigation is to identify a suspect using DNA evidence gathered from the crime scene. It can be analyzed and compared to DNA profiles in national DNA databases to help identify the criminal. When Florida prosecutors first used DNA evidence, they made way for a new frontier. Tommie Lee Andrews' case might have been the first time that DNA evidence was used in the United States, but it wasn't the first time it was used to catch a criminal. The first time DNA was used to identify the perpetrator of a crime was in England. Detective Chief Superintendent David Baker asked a local scientist for help identifying the owner of a DNA sample taken from a crime scene after Linda Mann and Don Ashworth were found raped and murdered. Detective Baker thought that they might have their guy after a man claimed to know the whereabouts of the second victim, Don Ashworth. When the police arrested and interrogated him, he admitted to raping and murdering Don, but insisted he wasn't responsible for Linda's rape or murder. Detective Baker didn't believe him. That's when he remembered hearing about a test that analyzes DNA, and he wondered if it could determine if the suspect was responsible for both crimes. Detective Baker contacted the man that invented the test, Alec Jeffries. Jeffries agreed to help Detective Baker by analyzing the DNA of the suspect and the DNA samples taken from Linda Mann, the first victim, and Don Ashworth, the second victim. After analyzing all three samples, Jeffrey was able to determine two things. One, the suspect's DNA didn't match the samples taken from the crime scenes, and two, the DNA collected from both victims was the same. Detective Baker was disappointed that their suspect wasn't the guy, but he wasn't going to give up, so he decided to try and test the DNA of every man ages 18 through 34 in a 5-mile radius of the crime scene, which was about 5,000 men. The government was reluctant to fund the $500,000 investment, but then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher supported the initiative. After 4,000 plus men had willingly submitted their DNA, there still wasn't a match, and the police were starting to lose hope. Then on September 16th, they got a tip. One man had submitted his DNA in place of a friend's. After learning this, the police immediately arrested both men and took a DNA sample from the man who hadn't given a DNA sample yet. His name was Colin Pitchfork, and his DNA was a match. This case was what inspired Florida prosecutors to use DNA evidence in their case against Tommie Lee Andrews. On February 6, 1988, Tommie Lee Andrews was convicted of multiple charges with the help of the DNA fingerprint held within his blood. Andrews was 24 years old when he broke into the home of a 27-year-old woman on May 9, 1986. He testified that he had never left his apartment that night, but the woman attacked identified him during the trial as her attacker. Life Codes Incorporated, a genetic research company, performed 3 DNA tests at the request of Florida prosecutors. They tested a sample of semen taken from the victim after she was attacked, and they also tested a sample of her blood. And finally, they tested a blood sample taken from Tommie Lee Andrews after his arrest. The man who performed the actual test was Alan Guisti, a forensic scientist for Life Codes Incorporated, who had performed the test over 200 times and held a bachelor's degree in science from Yale. Another specialist employed by Life Codes Incorporated that was involved in the testing process was Dr. Michael Briard, a geneticist with years of experience in DNA testing and many qualifications. He explained that the results of the test indicated that the semen found in the victim was most likely from Tommie Lee Andrews. Dr. Briard testified that the odds that it was another person's DNA were 1 in 839,914,540. Another expert witness called by the prosecution was Dr. David E. Huseman, who held a PhD in biology and was a professor of molecular genetics. He was asked to testify to the reliability of the test, and he explained a brief history of the testing method. He explained that the test was considered reliable by the scientific community, and it had been around/in use for years. After hearing all the testimony, the jury reached a verdict, and Tommie Lee Andrews became the first ever American to be convicted in a criminal case utilizing DNA evidence. In late October to November 1988, Tommie Lee Andrews filed an appeal with the District Court of Appeal of Florida's 5th District, challenging the admissibility of DNA evidence. In a summary of the opinion issued by Judge Orfinger, it talks about how the judge felt that he needed to answer two questions. 1, the admissibility of DNA evidence in criminal trials, and 2, the reliability of the methods used by Life Codes. To answer the first question, Judge Orfinger applied methods established by the United States Supreme Court for determining the admissibility of new forms of evidence. He used several different methods, but there are several similarities amongst all the methods. Basically, the new form of evidence needs to be reliable, both the scientific principle behind the test and the method that was used. It also needs to be accepted by the scientific community that the method belongs to. And the results from the test need to help the jury come to a more informed, unbiased decision. Judge Orfinger ruled that he agreed with the judge on the Andrews case and that the testing method used satisfied all the requirements. In the summary of his opinion, the judge talks about how a qualified expert witness testified that the methods used by Life Codes were in fact reliable. It was for these reasons that Judge Orfinger denied Tommie Lee Andrews' request for retrial. Over the last decade, forensic DNA evidence has been relied upon in over 6,800 cases. A review of current law reveals that almost every state in the United States has embraced and institutionalized the utilization of DNA fingerprinting for serving justice. Just a decade after Andrews' case, all 50 states had laws that required DNA samples from at least all convicted sex offenders. Virginia became the first state in the United States to require DNA testing in criminal investigations, which was put into place in 1989. The National DNA Index System was established in October of 1998. The Tommie Lee Andrews case revolutionized future investigations because it introduced a completely new way to identify criminals. As previously mentioned, just a year after Andrews' conviction, a national DNA index was created in the U.S., and the state of Virginia required certain convicts to submit DNA fingerprints. Another way this frontier has revolutionized the process of the criminal justice system is by helping to exonerate people who are wrongly convicted. The Innocence Project works to free the innocent, prevent wrongful convictions, and create a fair, compassionate, and equitable system of justice for everyone. That's from their homepage. The Innocent Project uses DNA evidence to exonerate wrongfully convicted people. DNA evidence hasn't only revolutionized how criminals are identified, but it also helps to better our justice system by righting wrongs.